The Grand Hall of the Celestial Assembly stretched across 3 kilometers of crystalline floor, suspended above a massive viewing portal that displayed the infinite cosmos beyond. Billions of stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, each one representing a civilization that had submitted to the Assembly's wisdom and guidance over the past 100,000 years. Commander Zexthar stood at the podium, his elongated form casting ripples of dark shadow across the luminescent stage. His species, the Vextharians, had ruled this particular sector for 40,000 years. They possessed technologies that could reshape planets, consciousness that could span multiple dimensions simultaneously, and a confidence in their superiority that was almost religious in its fervor. Behind him, arranged in perfect geometric formation, sat representatives from 372 different civilizations. Each one had been discovered, catalogued, and eventually absorbed into the Assembly's grand structure. Today was special. Today, humanity would join them. The species designates itself as human, Zexthar announced, his voice resonating through quantum speakers that reached every corner of the hall and beyond. The cameras broadcasting this moment had an audience of trillions. They originate from the Sol system, third planet, a world they call Earth. A murmur rippled through the assembly. It was not a sound of excitement. It was the sound of mild amusement, the kind of noise a parent might make while watching a child attempt to solve a problem vastly beyond their capabilities. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the transportation chamber, waiting for the signal to exit. Through the transparent walls, she could see the grand assembly stretched before her like an impossible dreamscape. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had trained for this moment her entire life. Humanity had prepared for 3 years since the first contact signal arrived. The weight of 8 billion human souls pressed down on her shoulders. Behind her, the support team watched through the monitors. Director Marcus Webb stood with his arms crossed, tension visible in every line of his body. He had wanted to come himself, but the assembly had specifically requested a representative with scientific credentials and cultural understanding. That meant Sarah. At 42 years old, she was Earth's foremost ambassador for humanity's first contact with advanced civilization. In the assembly hall, Zexthar continued his presentation with the enthusiasm one might reserve for explaining basic mathematics to a student who still struggled with arithmetic. The humans are bipedal mammals who achieved technological sophistication approximately 300 years ago. Their maximum lifespan is roughly 100 years. Their cognitive processing speed is approximately 1/10 that of the Krell species, and their individual physical strength is negligible even compared to the Morvac, who are known for their weakness. Laughter erupted through the hall. It was not cruel laughter, exactly. It was the laughter of beings who had seen countless civilizations rise from primitive conditions, who knew with absolute certainty how this narrative would unfold. These humans would be given menial tasks in the Assembly's vast bureaucratic machine. They would be grateful for the honor. Perhaps in 5,000 years, if they proved particularly useful, they might be allowed to operate a small manufacturing station on some remote planet. Zexthar raised his hand for silence. And, yet, there is something peculiar about this species. Not in a way that suggests any genuine capability, you understand. But, rather, something statistically unusual in their development pattern. They should not exist. This caught attention. Several representatives leaned forward, their various forms of physical apparatus shifting with interest. Explain, commanded the Prime Collective, a consciousness so ancient and vast that it occupied 17 different dimensional planes simultaneously. Their home planet, Earth, is exceptionally hostile, Zexthar continued. They refer to it as having extreme weather patterns. We would call it barely habitable. Ice ages that destroy technological progress every 20 to 30,000 years. Supervolcanic eruptions that darken their skies for years. Meteorite strikes that sterilize entire continents. Yet they survived. Not just survived, thrived. They became intelligent despite their world actively working against their survival. Remarkable resilience for animals, observed the Krell ambassador, her 3 eyes reflecting the hall's light with clinical indifference. Survival instinct is a primitive trait. Nothing more. Of course, Zexthar agreed. I merely highlight it as a curiosity. Their species also displays unusual social organization. They cooperate in groups far larger than their biology would suggest is optimal. A single human gives up tremendous personal advantage to function within communities of millions. Some of them dedicate their entire short lives to preventing others from dying. Inefficient. Irrational. All primitive species show such behavior, the Morvac representative hissed. Hive instinct without hive structure. A genetic mistake. Indeed. Now, they have requested a formal introduction to present their own perspective. A quaint gesture, really. I have permitted it out of anthropological interest. Their representative is approaching the chamber now. Sarah's pod arrived at the edge of the assembly floor. The doors slid open with a hiss of expelled air. She stepped out onto the crystalline surface and forced herself to breathe normally. The gravity was slightly higher than Earth's, but her body had been modified for this. She wore a simple black suit. Humanity wanted to appear professional, capable, trustworthy. No artificial enhancements, no weapons, nothing that might appear threatening. She walked across the endless floor toward the podium. It took 4 minutes. With each step, she felt the weight of billions of eyes upon her. They weren't hostile eyes, exactly. They were curious eyes. The kind of eyes you might turn toward an insect performing an unexpected trick. Greetings, she said, her voice steady. I am Dr. Sarah Chen, representative of the human species. I speak for 8 billion people from Earth, and I thank you for this opportunity to present humanity's desire to join the interstellar assembly. Silence greeted her words. Then, something extraordinary happened. Commander Zexthar made a sound that the translation systems rendered as a laugh. Within seconds, the entire assembly joined in. 372 different species, representing technological and biological achievements spanning 100,000 years, filled the grand hall with laughter. Sarah stood motionless at the podium. She had expected many responses to her greeting. Silence. Questions. Skepticism. But she had not expected mockery. And that was the moment when everything changed. In a communications bunker beneath the mountains of Switzerland, Director Marcus Webb's hands clenched into fists. He watched the feed from Sarah's neural implant, witnessed the moment his nation's representative was laughed at by the assembled powers of the galaxy. Around him, other leaders watched from their secure locations. The President of the United States. The Chancellor of the European Union. The Secretary General of the United Nations. They all felt it in that moment, the collective realization that humanity's hopes for peaceful integration had just been shattered by cosmic condescension. They're not taking us seriously, someone whispered. Marcus Webb stared at the data scrolling across his screen. He was a military strategist, trained for 40 years in human conflict. But this was something entirely different. This was humanity being categorized as disposable. As irrelevant. He made a decision that would ripple across the galaxy and, fundamentally alter its future. Back in the assembly hall, Sarah waited for the laughter to subside. When it finally did, she continued speaking. Her voice was quieter now, more controlled, but no less resolute. You laugh at our primitiveness, she said. You laugh at our weakness. You laugh at our brief lifespans and our supposedly irrational cooperation. You see us as failures of evolution, animals pretending at civilization. I understand. Your perspective is logical from your frame of reference. Zexthar made another laughing sound. Several other representatives joined him. However, Sarah continued, I would like to present you with data that might interest you. A summary of humanity's development over the last 300 years. She activated the presentation from her neural interface. Holographic displays erupted around the chamber, showing humanity's technological acceleration. The printing press. The steam engine. Electricity. Flight. Radio waves. Nuclear energy. Computing. Quantum mechanics. Genetic engineering. Artificial intelligence. We moved from steam power to nuclear weapons in a single century, Sarah said. We achieved the internet and global communication in less than 100 years. We successfully manipulated our own genetic code, defying the biological law that previous evolution seemed immutable. We developed artificial intelligences and learned to enhance our own cognition artificially. The laughter died. The representatives straightened in their positions, their varied forms of attention focusing more intently on the data. Your mistake, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, is that you measure advancement by current capability. You look at us and see primitiveness because our current technology is primitive compared to yours. You fail to measure advancement by trajectory. You fail to comprehend what it means for a species to evolve faster than any civilization in your recorded history. She paused, letting the data speak for itself. When you compare us to yourselves, you see weakness. When you compare us to our own past, you see something different entirely. You see a species capable of rewriting its own rules faster than your civilizations can adapt to new problems. You see a species that achieved global communication while still tribalistic. You see beings who learned to split atoms before they finished destroying their own nations. This is irrelevant, Zexthar declared. Raw acceleration does not change fundamental capability. You are still primitives, merely faster primitives. Your species will be assigned appropriate duties and, I'm not finished, Sarah interrupted. The audacity of a primitive species interrupting the formal presentation of a commander of the assembly would normally result in immediate ejection or worse. But, something in the tenor of Sarah's voice, something in the pattern of her data, made Zexthar pause. Sarah smiled. It was a human gesture, expression of teeth that was meant to communicate friendliness but, which, on a face that most advanced species found primitively simple, appeared almost unsettling. In 3 minutes, she said quietly, you're going to receive emergency alerts from your respective homeworlds. I strongly suggest you check them. In that moment, across the galaxy, the universe shifted on its axis. The Vextharian command station, monitoring 3 star systems, suddenly went dark. Not damaged, dark. Every sensor blinded. Every communication network scrambled by cascading encryption protocols that rewrote themselves faster than any decryption algorithm could crack them. The same happened to the Krell orbital platforms. And the Morvac deep space installations. And the Prime Collective's distributed consciousness networks. One by one, the Assembly's representatives received notification. Their civilizations were not under attack. Nothing was destroyed. But, for the first time in thousands of years, they were deaf and blind to their own territories. They couldn't see. They couldn't communicate. They couldn't control anything beyond the immediate observation chamber. Commander Zexthar's elongated form began to tremble. What have you done? He demanded. Sarah's smile never wavered. What have we done? She repeated softly. We've shown you something your trillion-year perspective has blinded you to. We've shown you that in the 3 years since you made contact with us, a species of primitives managed to reverse engineer enough of your information networks to achieve simultaneous global shutdown of every single representative civilization here. Not to destroy. Not to conquer. Simply to demonstrate capability. She took a step closer to the podium. You laughed at us because you measured capability as a fixed point, what we can do right now. But, we measure capability as trajectory, what we can do given time, resources, and motivation. You've just given us all 3. Sarah's next words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of the galaxy. Humanity isn't asking for membership in your assembly. We're offering you a choice. You can recognize us as equals, begin genuine diplomatic relations, and share knowledge with us as you would with any advanced civilization. Or you can continue as you were, and discover that the next time we shut down your networks, we won't turn them back on. She paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle. But, here's what you should really understand, Sarah concluded. We don't actually want conflict. We never did. We want partnership. We want to learn from you. We want to contribute to this galaxy. But we will not accept servitude, not anymore. Not now that you've shown us exactly how it feels to be laughed at by the people you hoped would welcome you. In that grand chamber, suspended above the infinite cosmos, the assembly of 372 civilizations faced something they hadn't experienced in 100,000 years. They faced uncertainty. They faced fear. They faced the undeniable reality that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation about a species they had dismissed as primitive. Sarachin turned and began walking back across the crystalline floor toward the transportation chamber, her steps echoing in the sudden silence. Behind her, in the disabled networks and darkened command centers of 1,000 worlds, the galaxy held its breath. And humanity waited to see what would happen next. Sarachan's transport pod detached from the assembly station and accelerated toward the waiting human ship, the ISS Challenger. Behind her, the most powerful collective in the known universe was experiencing a crisis unlike any in its entire history. She could imagine the chaos in those command centers, civilizations that had run on absolute certainty for millennia suddenly, confronted with the reality that their certainty was false. Director Webb's voice crackled through her neural implant. All systems holding. Your position is secure. Returning to home station in 12 minutes. The victory felt hollow somehow. Sarah had spent her entire life dreaming of first contact with advanced civilizations, imagining intellectual exchanges, opportunities to learn and grow as a species. Instead, she had just threatened them with the digital equivalent of turning off their life support. Through the observation window, Earth hung in the darkness, a blue marble suspended in infinity. It looked so fragile from here. So small. The assembly could destroy it with barely a thought if they decided retaliation was necessary. But they wouldn't. Not now. Because humanity had demonstrated something that changed the fundamental calculus of power in the galaxy. Back on Earth, in the Swiss bunker, Director Webb stood in front of the assembly of world leaders, all of them watching through secure holographic connection. The screen showed Dr. Chen's successful return, and, behind that, the status of what they had managed to accomplish in just 72 hours of preparation. Here's what we've learned, Webb said, activating a holographic map of the galaxy. Points of light flickered across the display, each one representing a civilization that had been affected by the coordinated strike. We successfully infiltrated and disabled communication and sensor networks across 437 separate installations belonging to the representatives in that assembly. And, here's the important part, we did it using reverse-engineered technology based on data from a single piece of debris left behind when their first contact ship arrived. One of the European representatives leaned forward. What are you saying, Director? I'm saying, Webb replied carefully, that every piece of information they've shared with us, every technical data we've intercepted, every broadcast we've monitored, we've been studying it, learning from it, and adapting our own technology to counter it. That device they thought was so secure, that beacon they used to communicate with each other? We cracked it. And, in the process, we learned the fundamental architecture of their entire network. The American president nodded slowly. So we're not actually as primitive as they think. We're not primitive at all, Webb corrected. We're different. Our evolution followed a different path. We don't have the advantages of a stable, single planetary government that lasted for millennia. We had conflict, division, competition. But that taught us something they've forgotten, how to adapt to an enemy you don't fully understand. Meanwhile, at the assembly station, the chaos had begun to stabilize into something more dangerous: organization. Commander Zexthar convened an emergency session of the Core Council, the highest authority in the assembly structure. 35 ancient consciousnesses gathered in a private chamber, beyond the view of the General Assembly members. Analysis demanded the collective prime, its presence dominating the space despite having no physical form. A Vextharian analyst, younger than Zexthar but still carrying the weight of 5,000 years of existence, provided the report. The humans used a cascading viral attack based on our own encryption protocols. They identified the mathematical weaknesses in our systems, weaknesses we didn't know existed because we've had no genuine competitors in combat-level hacking for over 10,000 years. They exploited these weaknesses simultaneously across multiple networks, each attack building on the others. It created a synergistic effect we couldn't counter. Could they strike again? Asked the Krell representative, her voice sharp with concern. Without doubt, the analyst confirmed. In fact, our preliminary analysis suggests they've left signature code in several of our networks. Code that allows them to watch us, to see our communications, to monitor our movements. We haven't expelled it yet because we can't find all of it. Silence filled the chamber. The Prime Collective's presence seemed to expand, filling every corner of the space. How is this possible? It asked. We've catalogued this species for 300 years. Our probes have monitored every technological advancement. Their current capabilities should not exceed ours by any measurable metric. Zexthar found his voice carefully. They were deceptive. Intentionally. When we arrived, they would have known we were studying them. And, instead of attempting to hide their true capabilities, they accelerated their visible progress while hiding their real advancement. We saw what they wanted us to see. A military deception campaign spanning 3 centuries, Krell mused. Assuming humanity actively prepared for contact from the moment they achieved spaceflight, that's possible. Difficult, but possible. More than that, another consciousness interjected, the Morvac High Mind, an entity that had experienced more conflict than most others in the chamber. Consider the strategic implications. If they had this capability from the moment we arrived, why didn't they act? Why did they wait until now? No one answered immediately. The question hung in the mental space between them like a spike. Zexthar finally provided his analysis. Because they were testing us. Testing our attitudes toward them, our intentions. They were looking for a sign that we could be reasoned with. When we all laughed, we failed that test. We showed them that we would never see them as equals, never respect them, never integrate them as true partners. They're bluffing, the Krell representative declared. They've used all their resources on this one attack. They won't strike again. They can't afford to. Are you willing to stake your entire civilization on that assessment? The Prime Collective asked quietly. No answer came. I thought not, the Collective continued. We must assume that humanity's capabilities are greater than we currently understand. We must assume they have redundancy, additional weapons systems, contingency plans we haven't discovered. We must, for perhaps the first time in 10,000 years, plan with the assumption that we are not the greatest power in our sector. The conversation continued for hours, but the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Humanity had irrevocably altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The question now was what would happen next. On Earth, Sarah Chen stood in a press conference, flanked by Director Webb and representatives from every major nation on the planet. The news was spreading across human media like wildfire. We survived first contact. We demanded respect from the mighty assembly. But Sarah could see the danger in the celebrations. Humanity was drunk on success, intoxicated with the realization that they had proven their superiority in one critical area, information warfare. They were starting to believe that they could take on the entire assembly, that they were invincible. She knew better. That knowledge came from standing in that chamber, from watching the fear and confusion in the responses of beings who had lived for thousands of years without experiencing real threat. She had seen how quickly they would organize their response. She had seen the cold calculation in their eyes. What comes next? A reporter asked. Will you continue to defend Earth this way? Will you attack preemptively if the assembly retaliates? Sarah considered her words carefully. What comes next is diplomacy. Real diplomacy, between equals. The assembly needed to understand that we will not accept subjugation. We've made that point. Now, the rest depends on whether they're capable of respecting another civilization. Director Webb added, we're opening formal communication channels. We're offering to share technology in mutual exchange. We're not claiming superiority, we're claiming equality. That's all we ever wanted. But, behind closed doors, in the planning chambers of every major military organization on Earth, contingency plans were being updated. New weapons systems were being fast-tracked. Advanced drone networks were being created. Quantum encryption protocols were being implemented across all critical infrastructure. Because while Sarah hoped for peace, Webb and the military strategists of Earth knew one immutable truth about species with the power to destroy worlds. They would use that power if sufficiently threatened. 3 days after the assembly meeting, the first formal diplomatic communication arrived from the Core Council. Not from Commander Zexthar, but from the Prime Collective itself. The message was short, encoded in perfect human language to prevent any misunderstanding. The Assembly recognizes humanity as a sovereign civilization with significant capabilities. We propose negotiation regarding mutual coexistence and the terms of your integration into our interstellar community. The Assembly requests that you withdraw your network intrusions as a good faith gesture. Sarah read the message 3 times, analyzing every word, every implication. The Assembly had recognized them. Not as peers yet, the language was still somewhat condescending, but they were acknowledging humanity's existence as a real threat rather than dismissing them entirely. She drafted the response carefully, working with Webb and the other human leaders to ensure the message struck the exact right tone. Humanity accepts the Assembly's recognition of our sovereignty. We agree to withdraw 70% of our network intrusions as a gesture of good faith. The remaining 30% will be retained for defensive purposes until formal peace accords are established. We propose a summit to discuss the terms of human integration into the interstellar community, with humanity's participation as a full member with complete autonomy over human space. The message was transmitted back through the quantum relay station that humanity had secretly built near Pluto. Within hours, the Assembly's response arrived. The Assembly accepts the terms of negotiation. A summit will be scheduled within 1 lunar cycle. In the interim, we are establishing a demilitarized zone around human space to prevent misunderstanding. What the message didn't say, what both sides understood without it being spoken, was that this demilitarized zone was actually a military standoff. The Assembly was positioning ships to ensure humanity couldn't attack them. And, if anyone on Earth had doubt about human vulnerability, the sight of those ships was meant to be a reminder. Sarah stood at the observation window of the ISS Challenger, looking out at the alien vessels now hanging in the space above Earth's northern hemisphere. They were beautiful in a cold, geometric way. And, terrifying in their sheer otherness, their absolute certainty that they could destroy everything humanity had built. Webb's voice came through the communication system. Second wave of sensors detecting Assembly fleet positioning. They've stopped at the edge of our operational range. They're not coming closer, but they're not leaving either. Standoff, Sarah murmured. Standoff, Webb confirmed. And now we wait to see if this standoff becomes negotiation or war. The next 28 days were the longest in human history. Negotiations began tentatively, through intermediaries and carefully constructed digital environments. The Assembly wanted to understand what humanity wanted. Humanity needed to understand the limits of Assembly power and the extent of their own risk. Slowly, carefully, the outline of a new reality began to form. Humanity would be permitted to maintain all 13 of its space installations. Earth would be recognized as human sovereign territory, free from Assembly interference or occupation. In exchange, humans would share their rapid development methodology with the Assembly and assist in improving defensive systems against technological threats. It was a negotiation that would change the course of galactic history. But, as the summit date approached, Sarah received a private communication from Director Webb. His face on the screen was grim. We've detected something. The Assembly has been developing a weapon. Not a planet killer, something subtler. A consciousness suppression field. The kind of thing that could render an entire civilization incapable of technological development for generations. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Why are you telling me this? Because, Webb said quietly, you need to understand what we're actually negotiating with. These beings aren't our friends. They're not our equals. They're something far more dangerous. They're civilizations that are beginning to see us as a threat significant enough to develop weapons against. He paused, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen war, who understood the absolute worst of what one intelligent species could do to another. Which means the question isn't whether we can coexist. It's whether, when this summit ends, they'll decide we're too dangerous to be allowed to survive at all. The summit chamber existed in virtual space, a neutral ground created jointly by human and assembly engineers. It was neither human nor alien in design, but something unprecedented, a compromise that reflected the merged architectural principles of two vastly different civilizations. Sarah Chen stood in this impossible space, flanking Director Webb on her right and representatives from every major human government on her left. Across from them, the Assembly's delegation had arrived. Commander Zexthar stood at the center, but the true power of the Assembly lay in the consciousnesses that manifested around him. The Prime Collective projected its presence as a shimmering field of light that seemed to bend the laws of physics around itself. The Krell High Mind appeared as a geometric crystalline structure that rotated in dimensions humans could barely perceive. The Morvac delegation existed as three separate entities, each one a predatory intelligence that seemed to evaluate every move of the humans with calculating precision. "We are grateful for this opportunity," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Humanity comes to this summit not as petitioners, but as partners. We've shown you our capabilities in defense. Today, we'd like to show you our capabilities in building something greater than ourselves." Zexthar's expression remained neutral. "You have 20 minutes for your presentation." Sarah activated the holographic display. What materialized before them was not a weapon. It was not a demonstration of military power. Instead, the humans revealed something far more unexpected: the complete repository of human knowledge, culture, history, and scientific achievement, packaged in a form compatible with assembly systems. "Humanity has experienced something that your civilizations abandoned long ago," Sarah explained. "We've experienced conflict, division, competition, and survival against impossible odds. Not because we wanted to, but because our world forced it upon us. And, from that crucible of adversity, we developed something unique." The display shifted, showing the evolution of human problem solving, the acceleration of scientific advancement despite civilization-level catastrophes, the ability to adapt and rebuild and grow even after existential threats. "We survive," Sarah continued. "Not because we're stronger. Not because we're smarter individually. We survive because we've learned how to create systems that reward cooperation while maintaining competitive pressure. We've learned how to innovate under constraint. We've learned how to see possibilities where others see only impossibilities." She paused, letting the data speak for itself. "The assembly has been stable for 100,000 years. That stability is your strength. But it's also your vulnerability. You've forgotten how to adapt to genuine threat because you've had none. You don't know what it means to be forced to change fundamentally or die. Humanity does. We'd like to teach you." The Prime Collective's presence expanded slightly, a gesture that might have indicated interest. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," Webb said, stepping forward. "Not subservience. Not dominance. A genuine exchange. You share your knowledge with us, we share our adaptability with you. You have the resources and technology to transform civilizations. We have the speed and flexibility to handle crises you've never had to face. Together, we could create something the galaxy has never seen." For a long moment, silence filled the summit chamber. The assembly representatives seemed to be communicating among themselves on channels no human could access. Sarah found her hands clenching unconsciously. This was the moment. This was when the assembly decided whether humans were worth negotiating with or worth eliminating. Finally, the Krell High Mind spoke, her voice translated by the systems into something humans could understand. "You're afraid. Your director has informed you of our consciousness suppression field. You're calculating your vulnerability against our firepower and realizing that no matter how clever you are, we have the resources to overwhelm you eventually." Sarah's breath caught. How had they known about the weapon technology? Had their infiltration been discovered? Was this about to become a confrontation? But then, Zexthar did something unexpected. He made a sound, not quite laughter, but something acknowledging. The human kept trying to warn us, he said. From the moment we began developing the suppression field, their network intrusions were attempting to prevent the project. Not by stealing the technology or destroying the research. By making the risk transparent. Making us understand that if we created such a weapon, they would treat it as a declaration of hostile intent. Webb nodded slowly. We weren't threatening retaliation. We were making clear the logical consequences of your actions. We were showing you that choice matters more than capability. The Morvac delegation made a sound like wind through a canyon. When it spoke, the translation system struggled with the predatory nature of its intelligence. Interesting. You're not arguing that you're our equals in terms of raw power. You're arguing that raw power without wisdom is self-defeating. More than that, Sarah said, sensing the opportunity to push forward. We're arguing that wisdom is about understanding consequences before you act. It's about recognizing that building requires cooperation more than dominance can ever require force. The Prime Collective's form shifted, and, when it spoke, there was something in its tone that suggested a consciousness truly considering something novel. If we abandon the suppression field project, if we genuinely commit to this partnership you're proposing, what assurance do we have that you won't use your strategic position to expand your own power at the Assembly's expense? Sarah had prepared for this question her entire life. You have our word, she said simply. A pause. Then, the Collective Prime responded, that's insufficient. It's not, Webb interrupted calmly. Because humanity will implement something unprecedented. We will submit to transparent governance. Every decision made at the human level regarding interstellar affairs will be broadcast to a public assembly oversight committee. We'll open our networks for monitoring, not as a hostile act but as a sign of good faith. We'll make our decision-making process public in a way that's completely unique. Commander Zexthar's form straightened. You would surrender your privacy for this partnership? We would, Sarah confirmed. Because we understand something about our own species that might not be obvious from outside perspective. Humans aren't motivated primarily by power or secrecy. We're motivated by reputation, legacy, and the knowledge that what we do affects others we care about. Make our actions public, and we'll police ourselves more effectively than any external oversight ever could. The Assembly delegation seemed to exchange information again, their alien forms shifting subtly with the transmission of concepts no human was equipped to perceive directly. When Zexthar spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. There's one thing we need to understand. In 3 years, you developed the capability to disrupt our networks. In how long could you develop weapons capable of threatening the Assembly's largest civilizations? Webb answered immediately. 18 months to 2 years. But we won't, because such a development would require resources that would be apparent to your monitoring systems. And, because, fundamentally, that's not what humanity wants. We want to survive, to thrive, to participate in galactic civilization as ourselves. Not to dominate it. How can you be certain of this? The Krell mind demanded. How can any civilization be certain that another civilization's desires won't change? Sarah smiled then, not the predatory smile she'd shown in the first chamber, but something genuinely warm. Because we've lived with the consequences of broken trust. We've learned, through painful repetition, that cooperation that's genuine creates more value than dominance can ever achieve. We're not claiming to be morally superior. We're claiming to understand, in our bones, the limits of power as a solution to civilization. She paused, then continued. When you have everything you need, when your civilization is stable and secure, it's easy to want to maintain that forever through force. When you've had to build everything from nothing multiple times, when you've had to trust strangers after being betrayed, you understand that some problems can only be solved through genuine partnership. The Prime Collective's presence seemed to settle, as if a vast consciousness had reached a conclusion. The Assembly will abandon the consciousness suppression field project, it announced. We will submit to the transparent governance you're proposing. We will treat humanity as equals in all interstellar negotiations. And we will work with you on developing adaptive systems for handling crises our civilizations have never faced. A wave of energy rippled through the summit chamber, surprise, relief, tension breaking after 28 days of standoff. But Zexthar raised a hand. On one condition. You will teach us. Not just share your knowledge, but teach us how you think. How you approach impossible problems. What you've learned from surviving in conditions we find hostile. Sarah and Webb exchanged glances. This was unexpected, and yet it made perfect sense. The assembly was willing to learn from humanity, to integrate human perspective into their oldest institutions. Agreed, Sarah said. We'll establish an exchange program. Humans will work directly with assembly members. We'll share not just data, but methodology. We'll help you understand how to adapt, how to think outside the constraints of stability. The negotiations that followed took 12 hours. By the end, humanity's status in the galactic community had been fundamentally transformed. They were no longer primitives seeking a place at the table. They were architects of a new model for interstellar cooperation, one based on mutual respect and the recognition that different experiences create different wisdom. But what happened next was even more significant. 1 week after the summit, the Prime Collective issued an unprecedented decree. All assembly members were required to review their own hierarchies, to identify species they had dismissed or suppressed, and to offer them the same respect that had been offered to humanity. Within a month, 17 civilizations that had been considered primitive or unstable had received formal recognition and offers of genuine partnership. Within 3 months, the assembly had begun to fundamentally transform itself from an organization based on dominance and control into something resembling a true democratic federation. And humanity found itself at the center of this revolution. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the ISS Challenger, looking down at Earth, now fully integrated into a galactic community that was learning to see strength in diversity rather than uniformity. Director Webb stood beside her, and, for the first time in weeks, he looked like a man who could finally rest. They're calling it the human model, Webb said quietly. Governments across the assembly are adopting our principles of transparent governance and cooperative competition. Something we developed out of necessity, something born from our conflicts and divisions, is now being taught to civilizations that had peace for 10,000 years. Do you think it will work? Sarah asked. Webb was quiet for a moment. I think it will work better than what they had before. I think the assembly needed to understand that dominance without consent breeds resentment and danger. I think they needed to meet a civilization that had faced survival challenges and lived through them, to understand what adaptation really means. He turned to look at Sarah directly. But I also think we need to be careful. We've positioned humanity as essential to the assembly's future. That makes us valuable, yes, but it also makes us a target. There will be those who resent us, who want to see us fail. Then, we'll be ready for them, Sarah said with certainty. Because that's what humans do. We survive. We adapt. We face challenges and grow from them. The final scene of this momentous period came when the assembly arranged a formal ceremony. All the galaxy's leaders, from the most ancient consciousnesses to newly recognized civilizations, gathered to witness humanity's official integration as a full member of the Interstellar Assembly. But, instead of a subordinate position, humanity took a place of honor not as rulers, but as teachers. As the species that had remembered what the assembly had forgotten, that growth requires challenge, that strength is measured not in dominance but in the ability to help others rise, and that the most powerful force in any civilization is the willingness to see others as equals rather than subjects. When the ceremony concluded, Zexthar approached Sarah one final time. You understand, he said, that you've fundamentally altered the course of galactic history. That if you'd shown weakness in that first chamber, if you'd accepted our dismissal, you would have condemned your species to a future of servitude. And that by showing strength, by demanding respect, you've set a precedent that others will follow. I understand, Sarah replied. And I accept the responsibility. Good, Zexthar said. Then, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, he extended his hand in a gesture of friendship that crossed not just species, but entire civilizations and concepts of power itself. Sarah took his hand, and, in that moment, the galaxy understood something it had forgotten in 10,000 years of stability and dominance. The future belonged not to the strongest, but to those who were willing to grow. And humanity had just proven it had an infinite capacity to do exactly that. The assembly had laughed at humanity. Hours later, the galaxy faced the consequences. But, decades later, as the implications of what happened in that summit chamber rippled across the stars, every civilization in the assembly would understand the true consequence. It wasn't that humanity had proven itself militarily superior. It wasn't that they developed weapons or conquered territory or demanded submission. The true consequence was that humanity had reminded the galaxy what it meant to evolve, to adapt, to face the unknown not with fear and dominance, but with courage and the willingness to grow. And, once the galaxy remembered that lesson, there was no going back to how things had been before.